what's up? Hello, I hope you all are doing well. If you're working with a Western calendar, we're in a whole new year, which means a whole new Goodreads reading challenge and a whole lot of time to reflect on what we have read in the past year, which is what I'm planning on doing today. Over the last 11 years, I have participated in the Goodreads reading challenge, and the number of books I've wanted to read has fluctuated from anywhere between 25, I think, to 40. And in any given year, there are the different challenges that arise throughout the course of life, and sometimes you don't meet your goals, but I am excited to say that this year I have read 37 out of my target goal of 35 books in 2022, which is very exciting, meaning I've completed 7 of the last 11 challenges I have participated in, which is more than half. And 35 books really seems to be the new place, like the spot that works. 30 seems to be too few, and 35 is just enough to be challenging to sort of get me over that finish line at the end of every year. Big shout out in this year gone by to audiobooks for allowing me an extra hour and a half a day to read and having a 45-minute commute in both directions in order to do it, as long as my car audio system is cooperating. And because of aiming to get to this goal so quickly in a mad dash at the end of the year, I managed to read 16 books in quarter 4. Actually, let's rephrase. I managed to finish 16 books in quarter 4 of this year. And I say finish because many of them I started at other earlier points in the year and did not finish until the end of the year. So we're gonna go through those one by one today. The first is a book that I've talked about a lot here recently, which is The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. This is the story of a indigenous woman called Tookie who owns, or at least works at, a bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and this is one of the first books that I've read that actually incorporates the pandemic into a fictional story, and the characters are tasked with coping with the realities of COVID-19, and I'm very excited to see more of that in fiction because I get the feeling that, if we're going to alter our lives in this dramatic way, we can't really continue to ignore it in text and in fiction as much as we might like to, without actually recognizing that the world is changing. So I am interested to see how that evolves. This was the first book I read where that had happened. And this was a really, really wonderful story. It's mostly focused on the internal workings of the character and working through a year of them struggling with the haunting of the bookstore that they work at. And so it's a little bit of a ghost story, but I suppose you could put this book into the category of nothing ever happens, or there's no plot. So if that's kind of your thing, then this is certainly a book for you. And I know that this author has had several very popular books in the past, and this is only one more that I'm sure folks will be excited to continue reading. The next book I finished was The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I recently reviewed this book, so I won't say much here, but it is worth mentioning that Henrietta Lacks, the real person, is getting her own statue in the United States for the great contributions that her cells have made to medicine and health across the world and for the benefit of all humanity. Definitely check out that review if you have not read this book, if you have not seen the television series that's been made about it. This is a really powerful nonfiction book told by an excellent journalist, and I encourage you to read it if you have not already, because it's a really interesting ride and really delves deeply into ethics, consent, and medicine. 3 things that are all very top of mind in our current day and age. The third book is called Enter the Ardvark by Jessica Anthony. And this is a short little book that we read for book club in either October or November, I can't remember which. But this is about a young congressman in the United States with a real interest in Ronald Reagan and emulating Ronald Reagan in pretty much every area of his life, down to the color of the sofa and like buying his cufflinks on eBay, and he's very obvious Republican. There are a lot of parallels drawn between the characterizations of these fictional folks to real people in the American political system. But the main character is a Republican, and he has a very deep secret until one day someone sends him a taxidermied aardvark to his front door, and that is just the beginning of the end of his life as he knows it. Similarly to a lot of historical fiction books, this has 2 narratives in it. You follow the story of this congressman and then also the story of a taxidermist and an explorer back in the 1800s in England, And it's hard to see at first how they're going to intersect and why these stories are put next to each other, but as you read on, and the book isn't all that long, so Jessica Anthony does this very well, it becomes very clear what parallels she is trying to draw with that. If you're looking for a short, snappy book, this is certainly one for you. It got a lot of praise from my book club, which is full of people of all ages and all interests. So overall, a great 200 something pages if you're looking for something that is going to be kind of hilarious, but also deeply thoughtful. Next was Muppets in Moscow, The Unexpected Crazy True Story of the Making of Sesame Street in Russia by Natasha Lance-Rogoff. I think I've said this already. This was my favorite book of the year. So way to go, Bex, who gave me this for my birthday. This is indeed, just like it sounds, it is a nonfiction book about making Sesame Street in Russia in the late 1990s. I did a review on this book. I think you should read it, especially if you have any interests in either Russia or children's television or excellent journalism. Maybe not excellent journalism now that I think about it, but this was delightful. Highly recommend. Later on for book club, we read a book called Because I Could Not Stop for Death, an Emily Dickinson mystery by Amanda Flower. Universally despised this book was by everyone in the library book club because this was less an Emily Dickinson mystery and more of a mystery that happened to have Emily Dickinson dragging the main character around in it. There were some interesting moments where it seemed like the Emily Dickinson character did not really have regard for the person she was working alongside and asking to accompany her on all of her jaunts throughout Amherst, Massachusetts back in the day. And as such, she turned out to be this kind of unfeeling character towards Willa, who is the main character, who is a maid in the family household, and her brother is murdered, and they have to solve the case to give Willa some closure. At the end, just a very hot button topic is sort of thrown in for good measure, and I didn't really feel like that was a necessary choice. Apparently there's going to be a series of these books, or there is a series of these books, but I am curious to find out from other folks whether or not you have read this, and if you did, does it come off, as it did for most of my book club, as a cozy mystery that is trying to be like elevated and enlightened and a step up by involving a famous poet, or is it just a piece of writing that doesn't necessarily hit the mark on being about what it wants to be about? However, the Emily Dickinson mystery was a interesting break from reading Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life by Eric Kleinenberg. This is a fairly short nonfiction book that is about exactly what I have just said. Eric Kleinenberg is a sociologist, and he spends a lot of time exploring libraries, particularly in major cities like New York City, and what they can offer to society and how we can use social infrastructure and connecting points within communities to rebuild life so that we are less individualized and less polarized. My biggest critique of this book, which overall I enjoyed, I thought that he went in the right direction with a lot of his inquiry and research areas, but my biggest question here was, can this be updated for a more modern time? The copyright on this book is 2018, which I believe probably means that the research was done ahead of that time, and this book makes use of the phrase, the biggest public health crisis to date, so I would love to see this book updated for 2020 and contemporary times, where I think we have perhaps a bigger health crisis that has happened in public health, as well as pay a little bit more attention to the use of language and using terms like rough neighborhoods. We all know what that means. That's very coded language, and so this purports to be sort of progressive, but doesn't really do it justice with the language choices that are being made here. So if you've read this book and you have thoughts about it, I would love to talk more about the way that this was done and how it might be adapted. I would love to see an update on this and how these strategies that are mentioned in here can be used in the time of COVID-19. Also in quarter 4, both Bex and I read On Beauty by Zadie Smith. This was on both of our Shelf Sisters series lists this year, by which I mean last year, and both of us had very similar feelings about it based on previous expectations we had around literary fiction and this author and the popularity of this author, I wound up listening to this on audiobook. Again, huge shout out to audiobooks for making my reading that much more smooth this year. I actually enjoyed reading it in print, I think, a little bit more than the audiobook. The audiobook obviously has some qualities that I always enjoy, like they do the different voices and for the different accents of folks, which are necessary in here because they are identity traits with each of the characters, but it certainly reads nicer in print than it does having it read to you, as I think most literary fiction probably does. You get the better sense of the literary devices when you're looking at the text. That's just my opinion. Keep your eyes peeled for a review on this book coming very soon, because both Bex and I had some things to say. Around that time, I also read a middle grade book called Ravenfall by Kaylin Josephson. I believe that this is going to be a series, and I mistakenly thought that this was going to be like a wintertime book, and it was actually a Halloween time book, so a little out of season, but a young boy shows up after having lost both of his parents and potentially his brother at an inn in Washington, or perhaps Oregon State, it's been quite a long time, called Ravenfall, and in that town there are a bunch of folks who have magical abilities, or supernatural abilities rather, and they go to great lengths to hide them from normal people, and they wind up being sort of the center of his whole life, and he makes friends with this girl who's going through some weird adolescent identity crises. Her family runs the Ravenfall Inn, and this was pretty cute. It tackled a lot of topics that come up in adolescent development, you know, like, am I good enough without this part of me, or am I good enough as compared to my sisters, or who am I without my family, and why do I want to be here, and what do I want to do with my life? And it tackled it in a way that kept to the theme of the book, which sometimes when you're trying to do those things in middle grade writing, they can kind of stray from the plot a little bit, and it's sort of like, oh yes, here's the social emotional components here, and here's the story over there, and this had a little bit more interweaving to it, so I greatly appreciated that. I would recommend this if you're a middle grade reader as well, or you're looking, you know, for something with the ease of young adult, but without as complex a story behind it. Although that's not to say there weren't a lot of twists and turns happening here. You can tell I really ignored the outside world for most of this quarter, can't you? Please don't sit on my bed in your outside clothes. Some essays by Phoebe Robinson, who you might recognize from Two Dope Queens. She is a delightful writer, offering opinions on like being a Black woman in America, not leaving your purse on the ground, why you should not be sitting on your bed in your outdoor clothes, and all kinds of other stuff dealing with the pandemic in lockdown with her partner and how that changed their relationship. Lots of very, very pertinent topics discussed here. I always love the use of footnotes to explain jokes and writing in the vernacular, which is spoken, so big ups for that. But I think if I could have read this book differently, I would have read it in less time. By sort of like mainlining each of these essays one after the other, I kind of got tired of the writing style, and I got tired of like hearing the same jokes or callbacks to previous essays, which I didn't really expect to experience that, so that was weird for me. I would go about this differently if I were to read it again and read one at a time over a longer period with more space in between them. I think it's kind of like when you watch too many episodes of like a comedic television show and the jokes aren't funny anymore. If you're binging something that you've already seen, or there's like 15 seasons of and you're just watching it constantly, that's like the only media coming into your brain, then it can get kind of stale. And that started to happen to me with this, which is not to say that it was not good, because I liked this a lot. She and I share a lot of similar opinions, which I didn't know. And also, let's just talk about the excellence of this dress. A+. Way to go for hanging on to this point in the video, because I'm barely hanging on at this point in the video. Around the middle of this year, I started to look for a cozy mystery to read with my book club in January 2023, and I wanted it to be something with non-human characters that was written for adults, which is a very niche thing that not a lot of people write. and I discovered a series of books in a series called Shady Hollow by Juno Black. Fun fact, that is a pen name. It's actually two women who write this. I'm blanking on both of their real names right now, but they go together in their authorial title as Juno Black. And this is the story of a small little village in the woods called Shady Hollow. And there is an investigative reporter named Vera Vixen, who is a fox. And she discovers the murder of the cantankerous old toad. Quite literally, he is a toad who lives out in the pond one day. And now she kind of has to solve the mystery because this quiet, sleepy town just has woken up to the fact that there's probably a nasty person in their midst. And so all of the characters are different animals. There's much made about how they have all chosen to live in harmony together in the forest and not eat each other, which is why you've got bears and bunny rabbits and stuff and mice all in conjunction with the mice and the owls all get along and they all go to the same coffee shop and the moose runs the coffee shop and everything. I was going into this with higher expectations, and then this book started to do something that I did not love, which is within the same paragraph gave you two different characters' perspectives, or sort of within the same exchange sometimes gave you two characters' perspectives. You would clearly be reading from Vera's perspective, and then in the next sentence it would be from someone else's perspective, looking or talking back to her, and I did not love that. I'm okay with point of view shifting chapter by chapter, or even once within the same chapter if it's indicated that there's a break, but to do so with no clearly identified break is really confusing for a reader. So that was the big thing that put me off from this book. The mystery was okay. It was fine. It was fine enough that I went on to read the second one this year already called Cold Clay. I'll talk about that at the end of quarter one. And I guess they're fine. I was really hoping for more, but I guess with such a niche genre, what could I really have hoped for that was better than this? Now we're really getting to some of the super good stuff that I crammed in at the end of December. Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. I have talked about a bunch already in the last few months. I listened to this book. It is a unique take on the sort of underlying unspoken system of caste in America that is racialized and is the way we sort each other into different categories. I listened to the audiobook of this, and I think that you should read this book, no matter who you are. That's all I'll say. I've talked about this before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. I also finished reading The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan, and this was a book that I struggled to get through because I listened to the audiobook and the narration was so intense. It's narrated by Catherine Ho, and she does a wonderful job conveying the intensity and the depression and just the really serious urgency and emotionality of all of the characters, particularly Frida, the main character in this book. This is the story of Frida, a mother of an 18-month-old child who leaves her baby at home, and unfortunately that action does not end well for her because she's left the child alone unsupervised, and Child Protective Services gets involved, and lo and behold, she is given the opportunity to regain custody by attending a new program called the School for Good Mothers. And so she spends a year at the School for Good Mothers, and you get to read about her experience going through that and working to get custodial rights of her child Harriet back. And this book is so well done. It's got an intensity to it that kind of makes you think the author has been through that experience before, even though it would be violating so many civil rights for a program like that to even exist. It was also on President Obama's best books that he read this year list too, so I feel double good knowing that somebody who was previously in a leadership position that might have control over government agencies like that also thinks that this book is really good, because I thought it was a great depiction of the way folks interpret government agencies and the things that we have to do in order to be proved ethically sound and responsible people. I overhear a lot about the work of social services as part of my job, and this was just a delight to read through. So if you're looking for something that's going to kind of grip you in, this is definitely it. I finished that book as I was traveling in December, and then also finished Beyond the Wand by Tom Felton, who you'll recognize played Draco Malfoy in all of the Harry Potter film adaptations. This was the most uniquely written celebrity memoir I've ever read. It opens with a foreword or introduction from Emma Watson, and apparently the two of them are like soulmate BFFs. And I think I was confused by the structure of this because it seems like Tom Felton put a bunch of stories down on paper, but they weren't necessarily stories, they were just sort of remembrances. Like, here's a bunch of things that I remembered from this time, and here they are, and if I had read them on a computer, they would probably have been like a page and a half, single spaced. And it was strange to see them be so short. I think we're used to celebrity memoirs having a little bit more heft to them, or having someone else help the person whose life is being written about to add to them and bulk them up a little bit. But this just felt like I was reading like, oh yeah, here's a story. Like I was at a party and I was listening to him recount these stories from his life. That guy has been through a lot, and he's really trying to hang on as a person, and I thought he made a lot of really nice points, and it was nice to, see another person with significant fame come out and say, I struggle with XYZ the same as all these kind of other people. So that was appreciated at the end. There are also some really cute sort of moments from the Harry Potter filming that I liked hearing about. It was kind of nice to see the behind the scenes nature of some of that stuff and how he got cast in the role and things like that. So this was not necessarily the best written book, most cohesive book I've ever read. It's kind of like an album where not all the songs really kind of fit together, but it was fine, I guess. I followed that up with Grave Reservations by Sherry Priest, and I only read this book because I saw on Twitter that there had been a new book in this series by Sherry Priest, and somebody was really praising her a lot, and I was like, all right, well, I'll give this a shot. I need something to read during the time I'm going to be away from home in December, and this actually turned out to be really interesting. This woman with some psychic abilities winds up teaming up with a police detective to solve a couple different cold cases in Seattle, Washington, and it's very funny. I appreciate that this author did not liberally use very colloquial, like fun, intelligent internet speaky type phraseology with both of the characters. She didn't overdo that. She did it just enough to keep that enjoyable and really make the dialogue sound contemporary. Whereas in the next book that I read, which was Below Zero by Ali Hazelwood. Ali Hazelwood of The Love Hypothesis and Love on the Brain has 3 novellas, which I think came out on audio first. That's how I've listened to them, and they are part of the STEMinists series, so these feminist women in STEM. This one is about a NASA scientist who loves space, who goes to Norway and reconnects with someone that she kind of hates or something like that. I listened to Below Zero in 2022 and have most recently listened to the next 2, or actually the previous 2, in 2023. I think this book, or these 3 novellas, actually really suffer from over contemporaneity, if I can make that a word. All of these women, in their either anxiety or concern or excitement, tend to use a lot of metaphors, tend to drop in a lot of contemporary pop culture-y, like almost Gilmore Girls-like dialogue, or into their thought process, into their internal monologue. And it's every sentence all the time coming from these folks, and that just doesn't strike me as how people speak in real life. Like, that might come up a couple different times in a conversation, but certainly doesn't need to be as constant as it is written. If I had the real texts in front of me, I would read to you exactly what I'm talking about. But I think that was the biggest bother that I have with Ali Hazelwood's writing now, is that that's fine once in a while, but you don't necessarily need to make unusual, extravagant metaphors constantly all the time with each sentence, no matter or not whether that's actually running in your character's head or not, because there's just not enough space in folks' brains for that sometimes. And then lastly, on the very last day of the year, I finished listening to Counterfeit by Kristen Chen. Also, this audiobook is narrated by Catherine Ho, and I recognized her voice instantly because it was so engaging in The School for Good Mothers. So it was unique to listen to her play different characters when I was so used to hearing her voice as Frida. And this is a story about a woman who does not love being a lawyer and kind of doesn't love being married to her surgeon husband, and their child is having some developmental issues around age 2 and is still nonverbal, and her life is just kind of like, ugh, how did I end up here? Why are things going wrong? Why are things falling apart? And she reconnects with her former roommate, who is running a counterfeit designer handbag operation, and the two of them get involved with it, and it takes off, and you get both perspectives from the main character Ava and Winnie, her scheming partner. And this book offers a lot in terms of sort of misdirection and who's a reliable narrator. It's not really a mystery, it's a retelling of something that happened, and also being in the present at the same time. I don't want to say too much about it, but if you are looking for like a fun romp and kind of want to learn a little bit about designer fashion and how things like that work and what the protocols around like how big name manufacturers maintain authenticity with their brands, this is definitely for you. It was fun. I really enjoyed ending the year with like a fun, what's going on, unreliable narrator piece of fiction. Plus the cover is also beautiful. This art style is gorgeous. And that's that. Those are all of the books that I read, or at least finished, in Q4. If you've read any of them, please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I am 3 books into this year, 2 novellas, and the follow-up to the Shady Hollow mystery called Cold Clay. Looking forward to reading another 35 books in 2023. We'll see if that happens, but I'm excited by the progress that I've made already, and looking forward to how the year goes. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having lovely weeks and lovely lives. Anything that you might want to know about us is probably in the description, and we'll see you very soon.